Welcome, everyone, to the February 2024 meeting of the Memphis Astronomical Society. I am your faithful host, Jeremy Veldman. Hope everybody's having a great evening. And we got a full program for you guys tonight. A lot of information to cover and a very intriguing presentation on the journey in astrophotography from Sid, who has quite an impressive resume. So we will get him introduced here shortly. But before we do, just a few preliminaries to cover. So let me go ahead and kick it off here. So again, we're the Memphis Astronomical Society. We're a nonprofit public service organization promoting interest in education in astronomy and related sciences. The best way to learn about us is on our website, memphisastro.org. We also have a Facebook group. Check that out. And of course, if you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We have pretty much all of our past meetings as well as other events on our channel. So that's a great way to learn about us and engage with us as well. If you'd like to join our society, just scan that QR code right there and enter your details. You can also go to our website, click the join button, and you've got two options. You can either join our email list, and we send out notifications about once a week, or you can join and become a full-fledged member, which of course we recommend. Very affordable fee, and you get numerous benefits, and obviously we just love having you a part of our community. So been a lot of growth and a lot of exciting things happening over the last few years. So whether you subscribe to our email list or join as a member, that's the best way to do it. Either scan that QR code right there or just click the join button on our website. Calendar of events. So we are in the month of February, and once again, it's spotty as we go forward here. But coming up, we have our next event is actually going to be Tuesday, February the 6th. It's the Bartlett Scouts on 7215 Centralia Road. We always need telescopes for that event. It does look like it's going to be clear Tuesday night. I do plan to be there. We got one or two other people coming out. But again, if you can make it, and you want to get out and kind of get past this winter withdrawal and see some clear skies and participate in an outreach event, we would certainly love to have you. So bring your telescope out Tuesday night, February the 6th, if you can. We start about 6:30, 6:45, and go till about 8 o'clock. Again, 7215 Centralia Road. Now, the following Saturday, February the 10th, we've actually got two events scheduled. We've got Pinson Mounds and Pinecrest. And obviously, when we're double teaming something, we need help. So we do have volunteers for both, but we could always use more telescopes. I'm planning to be at Pinson Mounds, basically hosting that event. And then the team at Pinecrest, we got a couple people going out there. So again, if you can make that, great. Now, I will say one thing. The advanced forecast is not looking promising. So the bad, we're in a little bit of a conflict here, double teaming on one night. But there's a good chance one, possibly both of those events could be rained out. So we'll keep an eye on the forecast and send the notice out in the next couple of days as we get closer. But tentatively plan on it if you can come out. Pinecrest would be probably my preference. Although if you want to make the drive to Pinson Mounds, that you're certainly welcome to do that also. It's the Pinson Mounds archaeological site near Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson, Tennessee, on 460 Oger Road, and it's quite an impressive location for doing stargazing and outreach. So if you want to try that, it's about an hour's drive from Memphis, maybe a little bit more. So if Pinecrest doesn't work, then shoot for Pinson Mounds. Again, just come on out. Bring your telescope if you can. We always need help. But we'll keep you posted on these two events. Weather looking a little iffy starting already Thursday, Friday of next week, and we'll make the official go, no-go call that morning. So keep an eye on your email. And then after that, the 13th of February, sandwiched in between two religious events in the month of February, the Super Bowl and Valentine's Day, is Jeter Elementary Space Week. So we always need help for that event as well. And if skies are clear, we'll set up, around 5:30, 6 o'clock. And that's a 2-hour event as well. It goes to about 8:30, 9 o'clock, give or take. They usually build a bonfire out there, bring hot dogs and marshmallows and stargazing. So it can be really fun. So we need help. We need more than 1 or 2 scopes. We need, ideally, 8, 9, 10 scopes. So if you can make that, Jeter Elementary on the 13th of February, again, we'll send notices out about that. Then, yeah, that would be terrific. So, and then of course we finish off the month with 2 events at Hinton Park. On the 17th, we have a regular observing/mentoring session. And again, we're doing this about once a month now. So if you have a telescope and you need help getting it set up and learning how to use it, this is an excellent opportunity for you to come out and get some one-on-one mentoring from some of our senior members. That's Hinton Park in Collierville. It's off of the Fleming Road exit. So it's near the soccer field. It's not the Holmes Road exit. You got to go a little further and then turn onto Fleming Road. We'll send a map out, but just make a mental note that it's not near Peterson Point where that big mound is. It's actually on the other side. It's the soccer field off of Fleming Road. And that will be February 17. And then a week later, is that date correct? It says the 25th. I guess it is. That's a Sunday. I got to double check with the outreach team. Somebody interrupt me if you can confirm this, but
that's correct.
Is that correct, Mylan?
Yes.
Okay. So on February 25, toward the end of the month, we have a Girl Scouts event there. And again, we're helping them with the telescopes and the observing. I will be there if it's clear. And then some of our members who are local will also attend as well. But again, feel free to come out, bring your telescope. So back-to-back events on the 17th and the 25th. And of course, the full moon is on the 24th. So nothing going on then. So that's kind of how we finish off the month. That's basically what we got coming up. Starting next Tuesday, the Scouts, and then we finish with the Girl Scouts on the 25th. And of course, you can always check the calendar on our website for more details of upcoming events. All right, just want to take a moment to welcome some of our new members, and I won't put anybody on the spot, but just wanted to acknowledge you. If you are on and I mispronounce your name, please interrupt me and correct me. I'll do the best I can here. Dylan Wamick, Jamie Eichhorn, Kathy McCraw, and Gordon McMurdy. So welcome to the Memphis Astronomical Society. We'll all kind of give you a virtual applause. We are very happy to have you on board and a part of our community. And reminder that if you are a subscribing member, you get access to our newsletter, The Meteorite. Check out this month's edition. And our next astrophotography group meeting, the Masfits, is going to be next Thursday, February the 8th. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's what I have on the calendar. And our past meetings are on our YouTube channel, so you can see January's as well as the previous months. And again, if you're a subscribing member, if you're a member of the Memphis Astronomical Society, this is another benefit. You can join this group. Great way to learn and get involved in the hobby of astrophotography. This group has been doing some really exciting things over the last several months. And it's like a moving train. Again, you jump on at any point in time. Doesn't matter if you're brand new, just getting started, or if you're more experienced. Just by hanging out with these guys, guys and gals, you'll learn the hobby and pick up things very quickly. So it's become kind of a subculture, if you will, kind of its own entity now from the Memphis Astronomical Society. And of course, tonight you're going to hear a very informative presentation on astrophotography. So we also have a form on our website. If you are interested in getting involved in this, you can just enter a few details about yourself and how you found out and kind of what your goals are with astrophotography. And that will help this group, better understand how they can service you and how you can get involved and learn and up to speed. It's kind of where teachers and learners get together. That's kind of the gist of this group, if you will. So February 8th, 7:00 p.m. We'll send the Zoom link out to the members. And again, if you're interested and you want to catch up, the past meetings are on our YouTube channel as well. And Cafe Press, get your MAS swag. There's the link. You can order t-shirts, mugs, ball caps, golf balls, just whatever. These make great Valentine's Day gifts also. Well, maybe not. But anyway, check that out. Okay, before I introduce the speaker tonight, I just want to say a couple things about the eclipse coming up. So We're 66 days away, and I kind of mentioned this at the last meeting, but want to give a little bit more specifics here. So again, in case you're dialing in late, on April 8, 2024, we have a total solar eclipse coming to the United States. This is the last one for 20 years. And you can see here the path of totality, about 124 miles wide, stretching from the southwest coast of Mexico and crossing Texas, Arkansas, clipping Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and then up through eventually Maine and Newfoundland. So if you want to see the full effect of this eclipse, totality, you got to be in this narrow band called the path of totality. So I get questions, what's it going to be like in Memphis? 95, 96%? That doesn't mean a thing when it comes to a solar eclipse, people. I mean, it's 1 or a 0. It's all or nothing. So I would really encourage people, especially if you're as close as we are here in Memphis, to make every effort to get into the path of totality and see this eclipse. You'll never forget it. So that said, where are we going to be? If it's clear, the tentative plan right now, well, the plan, if it's clear, is to be at Kayakima Scout Reservation near Hardy, Arkansas. I spoke with our contact earlier this week. She did confirm we have an open invitation. You do not need to be a member of the Memphis Astronomical Society, and you do not need a telescope, and you do not need to be a scout to attend this event. Just come out. We're trying to get as many people as possible into the path. So it's KKSR, Kayakima Scout Reservation. They're having a 3-day weekend event for the eclipse, starting on the 6th, and then, of course, stargazing the night or two before, followed by ending with the eclipse on April the 8th. So, and you can get information on their website, and they do have a cabin reserved for us. I mean, this is not 5-star stuff, but if you wanted to come out a day early, do some stargazing, crash, and then finish off with the eclipse the following day, they do have a place for you to bunk if you would like to do that. So where is this? It's about a 2.5-hour drive nonstop from Rhodes College, where we meet normally. 3 hours if you live east of, in the eastern part of Memphis. Factor in stops, maybe a little longer than that. But very easy to reach this within a half a day. And the other thing is it's a direct route. So if you make it to Jonesboro, which is about an hour away from Memphis, give or take, you're already in the path. You're on the edge of the path, but at least you're in the eclipse path from Jonesboro, Arkansas on. So you're just getting closer to the center line.
Jeremy,
yeah.
I'll tell you, the last mile or two into the camp is gravel road. And if you drive a Corvette, I recommend you leave it at home.
Corvettes, Teslas, Bentleys, any other high-end cars, leave those at home. Take the SUV.
Just something that sets that low to the ground. You need a little better ground clearance than that.
Gravel road. So it's about a mile of gravel road?
Yep.
All right. I was planning to drive there this week. Haven't made it yet, but probably next week, if we get a day or two that's clear, I plan to drive up there and scout it out and get some more specifics. But
they have 1,300 people registered, 1,300 scouts registered for it already.
Wow. Okay. So we got 1,300 scouts already. And Freddie's planning to be there. If it's clear, I'm planning to be there, but it's the most direct route, arguably, from Memphis to the center line. And you can see we get about 4 minutes and 9 seconds of duration during max eclipse, during totality. So that's pretty good. In fact, that's, compared to what we had 6-7 years ago, very good. Why this eclipse? Again, the article in Sky and Telescope last month, this eclipse occurs 1 day after perigee. So you're very close to true perigee, and then also the ascending node of the moon. So this is a very good eclipse in terms of duration. Not as good as the one that comes in 2186, but good enough, but not too bad. Now, what are you going to see in the night sky? This is during totality. I do this for some of the groups that we present to. So again, if we're in Hardy, Arkansas, around 1:54 in the afternoon, Central Time, moon eclipsing the sun, we will certainly see Jupiter and Venus, possibly Saturn, below Venus to the lower right, Mars, I don't know. It's getting pretty faint now as it reaches conjunction. And some brighter stars also. The eclipse moon will be in the constellation Pisces, my zodiac constellation. Thank you very much. I don't think any of the stars will be visible. It's a faint constellation. But in addition to some of the planets, you may have a shot at some of the brighter stars. So I know Orion will be lower on the horizon, pretty close to that 360-degree sunset. Andromeda Galaxy, don't get your hopes up. Anything fainter than some of the brighter planets, not likely. But you can kind of see what it looks like here. Maybe a shot at the Pleiades, maybe a shot at Betelgeuse and Rigel and Orion. So it'll be a spectacular sight during totality. Having said all that, clouds rule, as we know in astronomy. So I just wanted to kind of share this briefly here. So you can see from the GOES satellite image what we had this past April 8, 2023. And if you were targeting Arkansas, you would have seen the eclipse at that location. Here's what it looked like the year before. No go. The year before that, if you're in Hardy, you probably wouldn't have seen it. You had to go further south. Little Rock, Hot Springs, and anything further south of that, you know, you would have seen it. 2020, not too bad, looking good. 2019, not so good. 2018, pretty bad, except for a small hole further west. And then I was there in 2017 in Little Rock, and we had a perfect day there. So this was actually a beautiful day for the eclipse. Go back 24 years. I have data that goes back to 79. We don't have time to show it all. But if you just do good and bad based on total cloud cover, going back the last 24 years, basically 13 good days and 11 bad days. So what does that mean? It's about a 50-50 shot whether we're going to be clear there or not. Now, notice a couple things here, all right? And if I'm just going good, bad here, there's an interesting pattern. If you go back to the year 2000, typically a good day is followed by another good day. So we've had consecutive good days. And you can see here, a good day followed a bad day. So if that pattern holds, then our chances conceivably could be pretty good for a good day on the 24th. And also, my buddy reminded me, I don't know if it's La Nina or El Nino, whatever weather pattern we have right now, may be slightly more favorable for clear skies on April. And today is Groundhog Day. And 84% of the time, the groundhog sees a shadow. This year, he didn't. So he's predicting an early spring. So what does all that mean? Absolutely nothing. What it means is we're going to take our best shot at Kayakima Scout Reservation. That's plan A. But you need to have contingency plans to travel if you want to see this thing. And again, you can see the path of totality here. And you've got some good options here. If you can get to Little Rock, the entire I-30 corridor south, you know, to Texarkana and then over to Dallas is all within the eclipse path, as well as some spots further north. So we're going to start watching the weather 2 weeks out, 10 days out, 7 days out, and then we'll start panicking when we get 3 days out. That's kind of the plan. And then it'll be terrible eclipse anxiety on the 7th. But hopefully by the 4th or the 5th, we'll have an idea of where the best place is to see the eclipse based on weather. So, but anyway, Kayakima Scout Reservation, Hardy, Arkansas. If we're clear, that's where we're targeting. Anybody have any questions? I'll briefly mention this. Sky and Telescope magazine reached out to us. They have a special solar eclipse edition. I did pick this up, and it's just completely on the solar eclipse. It's got several good articles and good write-ups on it, more information on it. We are promoting this, and the benefit is we get a banner and a t-shirt and the opportunity to post our event and have them promote it for us. And you get a couple pairs of solar eclipse glasses. I picked this up. I had to pay for it, $18 plus shipping, or including shipping. So if you're interested, check that out. We'll send an email out on this with a link if you're interested in picking this up. And if you want to know when the next one is, August 23, 2044. And that one will be in Western North Dakota. or northeastern Montana, get about 1 minute and 41 seconds of duration during totality. That's the next eclipse to touch the lower 48, 20 and a half years into the future. So this is a pretty rare opportunity that we've got coming up on April 8th. Eclipse Ambassador Program. This is my last point here. Again, if you're interested, one of our members, Morris Butch, is an Eclipse Ambassador. This is a program that NASA and the Astronomical Society of the Pacific makes available to people who basically are making communities aware of the eclipse in preparation. Here's a couple flyers. All you do is scan that QR code. If you're interested in signing up, they're taking applications until February 14. Or you can go to eclipseambassadors.org to learn more. They're looking for more people, especially graduate students in the state of Tennessee. And we will have free eclipse classes at our next in-person meeting, March the 1st. And I'll be doing a presentation on the 14th, and I'll have them available then too. So next month, if you need glasses, it's your last opportunity. That we'll be handing them out. So it gets, things will start ramping up here as we get closer to the event. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and step aside and turn the program over to Merrill Miller, who leads our Memphis Astrophotography group, to introduce tonight's speaker. So Merrill, would you take it away? Do the honor.
I'll spend a minute or so introducing Sid. One of the things, besides my treasurer role, is, like Jimmy said, I'm the leader of the Astrophotography group. And something I always keep an eye on is the astro-imaging channel, because they have presentations that are just fabulous. Most of the time, they have a nice little spreadsheet that has by date and what the subject was. And I was going over it a few months ago and ran across Sid's presentation and watched it, and I said, this is just perfect for a lot of the beginners and as they go along the journey. So Sid's quick introduction. He's an electrical engineer from University of Nebraska. In fact, there's a lot of things that in his resume here that you'll find is common with a lot of our members. You were in a semiconductor field. He went to work for Motorola and Intel for 15 years, then started his own business, technical sales and support. And then he retired in 2018. His hobbies are photography, which is very common with people in our group, DSLR, radio control aircraft. We've got members that have apply those. He likes skiing and both water and snow, but he did make the comment that the aging process is starting to affect the proficiency there. He likes playing guitar and doing birding with his wife. And of course, the one that's going to lead into the presentation, he's got started, I think, 3 years ago in astrophotography. So it's going to be a good presentation. Particularly, I've seen some of the new folks here on the people who are on the channel right now. Listen up. You're going to learn a lot. And Sid, why don't you take it away? And you're muted.
Let's try that.
There you go.
And do you see my screen?
We
Yes.
do.
Are we on?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me this evening and giving me the opportunity to share my journey into astrophotography. And certainly, astrophotography is a journey, and it is not a sprint. It does take some time to get into the hobby. But before we begin, here is an amateur astrophotographer's disclaimer. The following document is comprised of sometimes incoherent ramblings of a wannabe astrophotographer. The opinions are solely my own, sometimes actually based on fact, and it's a compilation of information which I hope is mostly correct. Experienced astrophotographers may cringe at my process or maybe some of my conclusions, and if so, I ask for your help. I've made the journey with the help of various friends and forums, my local astronomy club, Facebook's groups, and YouTubers worldwide. And I feel like I really am drinking from a fire hose, and I'm excited about continuing my quest for knowledge and competence. Briefly, Merrill talked about some of my history, so I really won't go into that, but basically I've been involved in engineering and semiconductors and technical aspect for many, many years. My hobbies include the ones that you mentioned before. And certainly the most relevant hobby right now is astrophotography, the one I've been spending the last few years on and trying to gain some competence and produce some nice images. Primarily, my interest revolves around deep sky objects, nebulas and galaxies and clusters. And that's where my interest really kind of developed. And my history is with the DSLR. I did a lot of black and white photography. I used to buy the film in 100-foot rolls and develop myself. Some of you may recognize a 35mm canister, and there are probably some of you out there who've never seen one, but spent a lot of time with those back in my earlier days. But now primarily it's digital cameras, of course, and my primary camera has been the Canon Digital T3i. Basically, I'm self-educated with that as far as composition and layout and color and exposure, and a minor experience with Photo Raw and some Photoshop. So my interest in the night sky really stemmed around my experience with being outdoors in Arizona. We have some very pristine skies here, especially in the mountains, and did a lot of backpacking earlier on with my wife and some really beautiful skies. We also like to take boating trips to Lake Powell, viewing the heavens with my son. We lay on the boat at night with our star charts and looking at the stars and constellations in Bortle 1 or at worst Bortle 2 skies. It's really, really beautiful. So when my son was in 5th grade, I got him a scope for Christmas. But really, it was probably for me. But it was a Meade 6-inch. And it was a great scope to begin with. It's a computerized go-to, so it can easily take you to the targets and stars in the sky at night. It has its own GPS. It'll plate solve, self-align. Also has a audio program which will tell you about the objects that it zeroes in on. And it was a great go-to scope really to explore a lot about the night sky. But then life got in the way. As my son moved into middle school and baseball and high school and cars and girls. And with me, work, I was a business owner and doing a lot of traveling, and just got busy. So in 2018, however, I retired. And I joined East Valley Astronomy Club here in Arizona in November of 2019. And then 2 meetings later, COVID struck. And we all went to remote meetings like many, many people did. So at that point in time, I dusted off my scope and I joined the backyard COVID astronomers. My observation migrated in my interest in taking some photos since I did have a digital camera. So I bought an adapter for that Canon camera and attached it to that Meade 6-inch scope, taking some single exposures. And this was my very first deep sky astrophotography. It might be difficult to recognize what it is, but it is M42 Orion. Horribly out of focus, but it was what really spurred my interest in trying to take some better photographs and see what I could do with the equipment that I had. Well, I had some issues. In order to take good exposures, I needed to get some longer exposures time. And to get some longer exposures, I need to be able to track the target across the sky at night. So that really means I had an excuse to get a new telescope and also an equatorial mount. At that point in time, Celestron had a pre-pandemic sale, and they were offering a $500 discount on Edge scopes. I thought, well, bigger's got to be better. So I really, at that time, I had no concept of the difficulty of imaging with long focal lengths. So on the very last day of April of 2020, I put in a purchase order with my local vendor for a system. And I thought, yeah, I'm an engineer. I understand math and physics and semiconductors and computer stuff. How hard can this really be? Well, I had a large lesson coming up. So I placed an order end of 2020, and the delivery is going to be 30 to 60 days. And many of you are familiar with this. Then it was 90 days. And then they said, well, we don't really have any idea when we're going to get anything to deliver. So I spent the next 6 months reading Cloudy Night threads and starting to really understand how much I didn't know. Read the manuals on my equipment, watch lots and lots of YouTube videos. I became a virtual expert really without ever touching a scope. And I provided some guidance on the threads. So really, you need to be careful in taking anyone's advice on the internet, because that's someone maybe like me who really doesn't know what they're talking about. So again, buyer's remorse set in. I realized I really had no idea what I was getting into. Like, what have I done? I spent lots of time on internet and YouTube, but it looks like I'm really way over my head. What I should have done was bought a smaller focal length scope, nice wide angle, ideal for nebulas, easy to focus. Guiding is not as critical, smaller and lighter, easy to handle, less expensive accessories, easy to transport. All the reasons that for someone getting into astrophotography, you should start out with a nice wide field scope. Well, when I look at astrophotography, I really look at the 3 C's, and I divided it into 3 areas of capturing the data, calibrating the data, and finally creating an image. So let's talk about capturing data. There are lots of things involved in capturing data, many more than I first thought when I was starting to get into the hobby. So I'll kind of touch base on each one of those, and we'll take a quick look at what it takes to kind of put a system together and get started with imaging. Assembly was fairly straightforward. Basically, align the tripod as close to pointing at the north celestial pole as possible. Make sure it's reasonably level. I had a USB hub, which all the equipment plugs into. Of course, a power strip attached to a tripod leg. Kind of plan the cable and routing so you make sure that nothing catches and nothing obstructs. And I really wound up with really 2 connections, a power connection to the PC and the equipment, and then a single USB coming from that hub where all the equipment was connected to the laptop computer. Then need to be aligning the system. So a go-to alignment identifies basically your place in the universe. The mount then knows where it is, and when you issue a go-to command to take it to a target, the object will be reasonably centered in the eyepiece or the camera fairly accurately. If you're going to take photographs, however, you need to be concerned about polar alignment, and that's making sure that your system is accurately aligned to the north celestial pole. And that way, when you're tracking an object around across the sky, you can follow that object without any rotation in the frame. And that allows you to take long exposures and accurate exposures. But without good polar alignment, you can still track the object, but you're probably going to get some rotation of the object and some blurring of the object. Alignment, when you can see the north celestial pole, it's really pretty straightforward. You're basically aligning the axis of your mount to the north celestial pole, and therefore, as your telescope revolves around the north celestial pole, you're accurately tracking that object. And there's a number of ways to do that. A polar scope can sight right through the mount itself. Polemaster is a popular solution, which is basically a little camera that attaches to the front of your mount. SharpCap has some great routines. I use Nina, which is a control software. It has some internal polar alignment processes, and there's many other ways to do that. However, if you can't see the north celestial pole, there's a little different problem, and that was me. My neighbor's trees obscure the view of the north, and it was either time for some midnight tree trimming or an alternative way to do polar alignment. And Celestron, which is the scope that I purchased, has a pretty good routine internally. It works fairly well. And as I mentioned, I use Nina as my capture program, and it has a 3-point polar alignment routine that is also very, very accurate. So after things were up and running for about the first 6 weeks, I was concentrating on observation, basically becoming familiar with the mount and the equipment and the eyepieces, doing the alignments, setting up and tearing down the equipment, which is really important because as I started out with the Edge 11 from Celestron, it's a pretty heavy, beefy scope, and it takes a little planning in order to accurately tear it down and set it up to make sure that it's done properly, and also a place to store the equipment when it's not set up. And fine-tuning the cabling and connections and get everything so that it pretty much works, and just kind of enjoying myself looking around the night sky, looking at all the objects that I could find and really becoming familiar with the system. So next step, let's take some pictures. And again, as I mentioned before, to take some images, you need to take those longer exposures. And to take those longer exposures, we need to track that object as it goes across the sky. And we need the equatorial mount working to do that. Get the polar alignment. And we need some guiding assistance now for the mount, because the mount will track fairly accurately itself, but not enough to be able to accurately photograph. So how do we do that? That really brings us now to guiding. So guiding allows us to locate a reference star, which is our guide star, which we lock into with a separate scope. We'll typically take about a 1 second exposure on that individual guide star, and then we'll compare that guide star position every second. If that guide star moves out of the center of the frame, our computer then will send pulses to the mount to keep that star centered. And there's an excellent program called PhD2, which stands for Push Here Dummy, which pretty much works right out of the box. It's a great piece of software. It's free. It's well documented. It's available information pretty much anywhere you go. All the threads that associate with that will give you lots of information about PhD2. But right out of the box on a small system, it works very, very well. And it allows you to customize the system as you go along and get into more complex guiding. So here's kind of a setup. This is my current imaging scope, my 300 millimeter ASCAR, and this is the guide scope sitting on top. It's installed on top. It has a focal length typically of about 1/4 to 1/3 the focal length of your guide scope. And for this application, it's a 50 to 150 millimeter guide scope. There's a lot of them available, a wide selection. They all work very well. They're easy to install. They have excellent performance, and they work really well. And almost any guide scope you can get is substantially under $100, so it's economical as well. But however, when you start getting into longer focal lengths, up around 1,000 millimeters or so, it becomes a problem. And one of the problems you run into is if we take a look at that rule of thumb again, and again, my Edge 11 I started out with was about 2,000 millimeters. So 1/4 of the imaging scope for a guide scope means I need a guide scope of about 500 millimeters. Well, that's expensive. And as much as that, it's also very heavy. So we've got this large object sitting on top of my telescope. Well, my telescope is basically an aluminum tube with some mirrors inside. And the weight of that extra scope will actually deflect that tube, and you get something that's called flexure. And when the tube changes position or deflects, that changes the position of your mirror, which changes the focus and causes all sorts of problems. So you've also got to deal with the moment of inertia, which is basically the mass times the distance squared of this object sitting on top of your scope. So when you try to move the scope, you have a large resistance of movement. So it becomes a difficult situation. Well, how do you solve that? Well, it's something called off-axis guiding. And it's really required as you start to approach 1,000 millimeters or greater. And what that does, it allows us to orient ourselves quickly. And James Lamb is a YouTuber who produces some very technical YouTube videos and very detailed. And he had an excellent discussion on setting up off-axis guiding with celestron telescopes, which I happen to have. So I spent a lot of time listening to James Lamb, and he's one of the YouTubers that I follow religiously and looking at the information he puts out. So I followed his guidance, if you'll excuse the pun, and we got on board with the off-axis guider. The off-axis guider looks something like this. This is the internal workings. This is a prism. So we capture some of the light coming down the image train. We redirect it to the sensor on the guide camera. The critical thing here to mention is that the sensor, or this prism that extends into the light train, we need to make sure that that doesn't interact or cause a problem with the images trying to hit the sensor in our imaging camera. And also the distance from the prism to the sensor in the guide camera and the distance from the prism to the sensor in the imaging camera needs to be the same. And that way, when our imaging sensor is in focus, our guide camera is in focus, and everything works in parallel. And this is my particular setup. This is my off-axis guider sitting here and the guide camera. So we've got the imaging train with the imaging coming here. I split off a part of that with the prism, send it up to the sensor and the guide camera. And then every second, I'll take an exposure. And if my target or my guide star starts to drift, my computer then will send a control back to the mount to make sure that I'm back on target. Any questions on what we covered so far before I continue? We okay with that? All set? Okay, I'll continue on then. So let's talk about the rest of the portion of getting ready to do some imaging. Camera, time to capture some data. Most people have a DSLR of some type, and they're really excellent imaging cameras. They're fairly modern CMOS sensors. They make really powerful astrophotography cameras, And if you already have one, it's a good place to start. And that's exactly what I started with, and attaching that to my telescope. Both my initial telescope, the Meade, and my telescope that I purchased, which was the Celestron. But as soon as you can, I would advise getting involved and getting a dedicated astro camera. This was the first one I used. It was a color camera. Again, some fairly sophisticated CMOS sensors. But the most important thing is that you can cool the sensor, which I'll talk about later when we talk about calibration. But if you can cool a sensor and maintain a constant temperature on your imaging sensor, you can greatly reduce some of the dark current, which greatly simplifies some of the calibration processes. A lot of vendors have those available. They're pretty reasonable price, and they really, really do an excellent job as far as capturing astro photos. Focusing. If you're not in focus, you're recording garbage. No matter how expensive your equipment is or how detailed it is, if you're not in focus, you don't really have a good image. Focusing methods, visual, basically you can go to a bright star, adjust the focus to achieve the smallest and brightest star that you can obtain. And also you can get a micro focuser, which helps you adjust that, because when you grab onto a focus knob on most telescopes, unless you have a really fine control, it's very difficult to minutely change that focus. So you can spend about $300 for a micro focuser, or you can stick a clothespin on the focusing knob, which I did, which gives you a longer lever arm, and then you can very accurately adjust the focus. A bat knob mask is really almost a mandatory, and it's a diffraction mask that you put over the front of your telescope, and then you get an image of a star. If the star is out of focus, that center diffraction spike will not be centered on the star. When the star is in focus, that diffraction spike will be centered, and you can see here on the right that it's off-center to the right. So this is really a very accurate method of obtaining very, very good focus. It works very well. This mask is very inexpensive, and I'd highly recommend getting one right away if you're starting out trying to work on focus. If you're going to be spending some time doing astrophotography, really recommend that you get into an autofocus situation. Again, if you're not recording, or if you're not in focus, you're recording garbage. And all sorts of things can happen while you're imaging at night. The temperature will change, which changes your focus. Seeing conditions will change, which changes your focus. Sometimes just the orientation of the scope, especially with an SCT, where it's possible for the mirrors to move a little bit, will change your focus. So during an imaging session, you need to be constantly refocusing the system and making sure that your image is sharp. And the way a computerized focuser works is that this is the focusing knob on my telescope, so that comes off, and this focuser attaches to the shaft on that focusing knob. And then the computer will be able to determine and adjust this to get your proper focus. Well, how does the computer do that? Ideally, a star would be a point source, but of course, a star has some magnitude and it occupies some number of pixels. But if you take a look at the half-lux diameter of that star, if you minimize that value, you're in the best possible focus you can obtain. So the way an autofocuser works is that the computer will take various images and then move the focusing knob, take an image, move the focusing knob, take an image, and at some point in time, it can calculate this parabolic curve, and the low point on that parabolic curve is the best possible focus. So when it does an autofocus routine, it's doing just that. It takes multiple points, calculates the curve, determines what that focus is, and adjusts that point to your from your computer to your telescope. This is one method where it attaches directly to the focusing knob. This is another method. This happens to be a focuser as well, and this one basically shoves the image crank back and forth to achieve proper focus. So they both work very well. Exposure. What's the correct exposure? Now you get into an area which is in constant controversy. You can look at any Cloudy Nights thread or any thread on YouTube, and you'll find that people are talking about, how do I get the correct exposure? What is the correct exposure? And the answer is, well, it depends, much like everything else. Basically, longer exposures will tend to saturate the whites, so you'll get stars that are completely saturated. Shorter exposures are often better for light polluted skies because the light pollution can quickly swamp out your target and your information. And the way we really achieve that or work on exposure is using filters. So we'll only allow specific bandwidths of the target that we're shooting to pass through our system so that we can hopefully eliminate some of that light pollution. Well, where do I start? I start by looking for saturating the brightest stars. I don't know if this shows up too well on the screen, but here are 3 points on the screen where stars are showing up that are white on an unstretched image. Can you see that? Does it come through at all?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Anyway, these are 3 stars that on an exposed frame are showing that are saturated because they're as bright as they're ever going to be. They're as white as they're ever going to be. But if you look at the rest of the frame, you can see the frame is all sorts of gradations of gray, which is exactly what we're looking for. So here we have a good image from basically black to white, which are those saturated stars, with all levels of variations in between. So now I have a good exposure. I've got a very, very little exposure saturated, and I've got a lot of information here as far as the grayscale is available. And basically, I take a look and take a bunch of exposures and compare, develop kind of a personal database of my preference for various target types and the equipment and filters and the exposures that relate to that, and then evaluate the saturation and adjust the exposure so I'm just barely saturating the brightest stars. Also on AstroBin, which if you're not familiar with is a fantastic online repository of images from amateur astrophotographers from all over the world, and literally there are thousands there. And you can take a look at a particular target and search for a particular set of equipment that's similar to yours, and you can take a look at that individual amateur astrophotographer's information on the equipment they used, the exposures they used, the filters they used, and all sorts of information that will give you a great starting point to determine what type of exposure or what type of filters might work with the target I'm trying to get to. And also ask somebody, use the experience of people who've been there and done that. Utilize your local vendors, club members, friends, cloudy nights, various threads, and utilize your local vendor. Starzona is the vendor that I use in Tucson, where I bought my equipment. And everybody in the store has a lot of experience with scopes and filters and light conditions, and they're a wealth of knowledge. And that's kind of the first place that I went when I was trying to take a new target or a new system configuration about what have you done? What are your recommendations? Here's my sky conditions. What should I do? What should I be aware of? And they're a great, great start. So, highly recommend find a good astronomy shop and utilize the expertise of the people in that shop. And if you really want to dig into it, there's a gentleman called Dr. Glover, who is part of SharpCap, and he has a couple of videos that really get into the details of exposures and gain. And if you're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of talking about how to calculate the proper exposure, you can spend several hours looking at his videos. This is the human eye light palette. We can basically see a fairly limited spectrum, really, from the violets and up to the reds, from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. And that's really a pretty narrow spectrum of light. So we're taking a color photograph, even though we may have a color camera. On each individual part of that sensor, there are really 3 filters. There's a blue, a green, and a red. And then the camera combines those together to give us that color photo. And traditionally, there was sort of a gap between the green filter and the red filter. And that happened to be the area where a lot of the parking lot lights and the freeway lights and light pollution existed. So by using this combination of filters, you could get rid of some of that light pollution. Well, the problem we're encountering now is that with LED lighting, is that LED lighting can be all across the spectrum. So that just complicates the problem of getting our astrophotos and trying to eliminate the unwanted light that we have. Now, you may have heard something called the Hubble palette, or it's also called the SHO palette, which is sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen. And so what we do here in taking a look at emission nebulas, who are primarily emitting in those wavelengths based on their composition of material. For oxygen, astrophotographers are typically using filters of somewhere between 3 and 7 nanometers bandwidth. The same thing for hydrogen alpha and the same thing for sulfur. So now we have a bandwidth of a total of maybe 3, 9 to 15 nanometers out of this 300 nanometers. So for those particular targets, we're very closely only accepting the light that target emits and eliminating the rest of the light pollution. Now, and here in Arizona, I'm in Bortle 8 skies, which are really nasty skies. They might even be closer to Bortle 9. So lots of light pollution. It's probably been a couple of decades when you could have seen the Milky Way from my backyard. So it's mandatory to use filtering of some type to be able to take some astrophotos. Here's some of the ones that I use. I use some filters from Optolong. And L Extreme is, again, it's a 7 to 10 nanometers on hydrogen alpha and oxygen. So it's great for those emission nebulas. L Enhance is a little wider spectrum. And so if you get around to areas where you've got some reflection nebulas, it helps with those. And for galaxies, which have a combination of a lot of nebulas and lights and different reflection and emission nebulas. There's an L-Pro filter, which allows in, again, most of that light, but then screens out a lot of that light pollution. I also use something called the NBZ filter for fast focal lengths, because the light tends to shift on some of the filters when you get into fast focal lengths. But really, there's a whole variety of manufacturers and filters. People are now talking about triple filters and quad filters from Atlia and Astronomic and Beta and Astrovan, and the list goes on. But when you're photographing either in color or using monochrome, you really need to be taking a look at a decent filter network that will take care of the objects that really you're trying to image. And any questions on those areas that you might want to address now? So if you think of some, we'll also open up some sections at the end. So we'll try to take some questions if you have something that hopefully I can try to explain. So let's continue on. Finding a target. Well, you would think with the infinite boundaries of space, it would be pretty easy. But in order to find a target, you've got to be able to locate a target. And to locate a target, you need a coordinate system that will accurately identify exactly where that target is in the night sky for all night skies at all times. And also a planetarium program, a Sky Atlas program will give you a perspective as to what that target's going to look like. And also you can input the parameters of your particular system, and it will give you an idea of how that target will frame up with your particular configuration. So the coordinate system, RA and DEC. And it took me a while to get my head around RA and DEC and really kind of understand it and utilize it. RA is right ascension, and it's a number of hours behind the sun on March 21st, the vernal equinox, that our target is. Well, how do we arrive at that? It had to start someplace. So March 21st was as good as any as a reference point to continue to talk about establishing what the right ascension is of our target. And declination, that's the angle of our target when it passes through the meridian. And the meridian is that line between the north celestial pole and the south celestial pole that divides our sky in the east side and the west side. Here's a couple of YouTube videos of Dr. Van Briesen, which I've watched many, many times, and I go back to occasionally again to re-educate myself if I start to confuse myself, but I would highly recommend those as a reference point in understanding the coordinate system. And here's a brief excerpt from one of his lectures on right ascension.
And now let's see if we can figure out the coordinate system of the celestial sphere. And the two coordinates that we need to use is what we call the angle of declination and the right ascension. And most objects in the universe, such as famous and bright stars, Sirius, Betelgeuse, Quarks, and so forth, are indicated as their position being at some right ascension and some angle of declination.
So here's some target ideas where I find some of my targets. As I mentioned, I use Astrovan. They're a great, great resource. If you find a particular photographer whose work that you like, you can follow him or them. And then anytime they post a photograph on Astrovan, you get an email. It'll look something like this with a little thumbnail of the item, which you can click on. It will take you directly to that item in Astrovan. And then you can take a look at, again, the position of that particular target, the RA and DEC coordinates, the equipment that they use to photograph it, the filters they use, the exposures they used, and any comments they may have about how they photograph that object. A great, great resource. I'm constantly getting emails now from Astrovan from the number of photographers that I followed. So it gives me a lot of ideas about targets that I might want to take a look at. And if they're available in my night sky, I'll add them to my list. Facebook also. I follow a number of forums on Facebook. Masters of Pix Insight is a great one, and Astrophotography for Beginners. Again, photographers are always posting their photographs or asking questions or having threads. And by looking at those, you can get lots of great ideas for targets that you may not have been exposed to that you can add to your portfolio of things that you'd like to image. Telescopius is a web-based program which has a large database of astro images. And again, a great, great resource. I use Sky Safari, which is an iPad app, which also has its internal database of images. I use that all the time to help identify and track images. Nina, which is, I mentioned, the program I use to control my system, also has an internal Sky Atlas and are very, very good. And there's a multitude of other things that you can use that will give you some ideas about targets that will appear in your sky, and things that you might be interested in pursuing. So find a target. So when I look for a target, ideally, I'd like to find a target that passes through the meridian at midnight. Well, why is that? Well, again, that meridian is a line that's directly above us. That separates or connects the north celestial pole and south celestial pole and divides the sky between east and west. So if the target passes the meridian at midnight, if it's directly above me, that means when it's first getting dark, I can pick up that target someplace in the eastern sky and follow it to the meridian. And then I can follow that target from midnight throughout the western sky until nautical dawn shows up, or till I get to about 35 degrees, which is about the limit which I'll try to image. Below that, you're shooting through a lot of atmosphere, and it's very, very difficult to get good data. Or in my case, until my neighbor's trees show up again. So let's look at an image plan. I mentioned before that the right ascension is the number of hours behind the sun that the target is on March 21st. Well, if the target is right on the sun at 0 hours on March 21st, I'll never be able to see it because it's always directly right with the sun. So that tells me that what I really want to be able to do is I want to look at that target that's delayed by 12 hours. So when this at midnight, my target is at the meridian. So I made myself a little chart of these are RA values for the particular month. And any target with that RA value will appear somewhere near the meridian at midnight. So that gives me an opportunity to identify if that target is something I want to try to image that particular month. Well, I made myself a little RA chart. And basically how this works is that here's midnight. So if I'm looking for a target early in February, say if I wanted to go out and find a target tonight on February 2nd, the arrow says that I need a target somewhere between an RA of 8 and 10, which is exactly what we're looking at here. And let's say next month, I want that target at midnight, early in March, to be somewhere near the meridian. I need an RA of somewhere between 10 and 12, and that puts me in the month of March. So with that, I can find a target that will give me maximum time on that particular evening that I can follow that target throughout the sky. So let's look at an example. Let's say in the month of March, I want to find a target with an RA of somewhere between 10 and 12. And for me, I'm looking for either a galaxy or a nebula and something that's above 35 degrees during that time period. Well, one thing, of course, you have to be concerned about is our good old moon. And it becomes difficult to image at night when we have a full moon with lots of light. Narrowband imaging is not so difficult because if you remember, we're only looking at a 3 to a 7 nanometer segment across 3 different segments at that particular evening. So we can still do some decent jobs of narrowband imaging when the moon is out. But if you're going to try to image color, RGB, the darker the moon, the better. So in this particular case, for the month of March coming up, here we are around March 8th or 9th. So we have a dark sky. So that's a good place to take a look. In Sky Safari, it has an inquiry capability. So I said, well, I want to find a target with RF 10 to 12, and this kind of criteria, give me a list of potential targets. And Sky Safari came up with a list from its database of these particular targets. So I said, well, let's take a look at M95. And M95 has these particular coordinates for RA and DEC. This is a screen clip from NINA, which I mentioned I use. It has an internal database. So when I search for M95 in NINA, I get this pictorial representation. Here's my IR and DEC. Shows me what the moon is at that particular time, some idea of what that might look like in the framing. And then also it tells me where that target's going to be across the night. So here we are at midnight. My target's going to be at the meridian at about 68 degrees in the south. And if I look at 35 degrees where I don't want to image below, that's somewhere here, somewhere close to 9 o'clock when it's coming up in the east. And over here at 35 degrees, it's somewhere close to 4 a.m. So from 9 o'clock to 4 a.m., I can image that target. So I can almost get 7 hours on that target of imaging time in that one evening. So that's an ideal target for following on early in March as far as something to image. Also in NINA and Stellarium and Telescopius and a multitude of other programs, by inputting your parameters of your particular telescope and your camera, it will display what that target's going to look like in your imaging frame. So here's what NINA displays. Here's what Stellarium showed me that it's going to look like in my camera frame. And here's what Telescopius showed me that's going to look like in my camera frame. So now I know I have a target. I can get 7 hours of imaging on that target during the night. And it's going to frame up pretty nicely in my camera. And I have an opportunity to get a pretty good image. Now, I've identified that target as being a prime target on March 9th, so I go to my iPhone and I put an event in my iPhone that says I want to repeat this yearly, so March of 2024 and March of 2025 and on out, my iPhone is going to give me a notice 1 week before the targets and its prime point that might be a target that I'll want to image for this particular month. I can also attach to that a screenshot of what that target looks like, so when I'm looking at my calendar, I can determine if that's something I want to take a look at. So over time, after looking at targets from AstroBin and Facebook and Stellarium and Telescopius, I built a database of potential targets for coming up in March. So I can take a look at some of these and take a look at ones that I may want to image. I can click on each one of those. And again, I can take a look at the screenshot that I captured, get an idea of the framing, and determine if that's a target that maybe I want to put on the calendar for this month as soon as I can get some clear nights. Any questions on targeting and framing? Okay, let's go into 4 things that'll make you look like a pro. Plate solve, dither, meridian flip, and automation. So plate solving, what is it and how does it work and what does it do for us? Well, early on, when earlier astronomers were looking at targets at night, let's say at Mount Palomar some time ago, they were zeroing on a particular target and they were going to take some photographic plates of that image that particular night. And this is exactly what they would do. They would have a large photographic plate on the telescope. There would be an individual that had control of the RA and deck axis adjustments, and he would be continually manually adjusting that telescope through the night to keep that target centered while we're exposing that target on this photographic plate. The following day, that photographic plate would be developed, and there would be a team of people who would look at that plate. They could say, well, that particular night, we know we were zeroing on M42, and here's M42 on the photographic plate, and they'll look then at an astronomical database that identifies where M42 is. So then we'll take a look at M42 here, M42 there, here's another star, there's another star, there's another star, there's another star, and they will solve that photographic plate for that image. So now we have a defined photographic plate from the night before, and the astronomers can study that and know exactly what they're looking at and where everything is located. Well, for us, we now have a computer that does that in a matter of seconds. So we can take an image, have the computer plate solve it, and know exactly where that image is located and how it's positioned in our frame. So that means now that our go-to doesn't have to be perfect. If our go-to alignment gets our target somewhere in reasonable position in that frame, we can take a picture of that target, do a plate solve, and then our computer will send some commands to our mount to center that target exactly in the center of our frame, exactly in the center of our viewfinder. So now that means that we can image that same target with exactly the same framing on different nights. Or if we took that target 2 or 3 years ago, we can take the data that we took several years ago and we can combine that with the data that we're taking tonight, and it will be exactly located and exactly aligned in that frame, and we can add to that data. And that's also, we require that for the meridian flip, and we'll talk about the flip a little later, but basically we're changing from the eastern side of the sky to the western side of the sky. So we have to physically reorient our system and then relocate our target. There's a variety of programs that do that. I use PlateSolve 3, works very well. There's some other ones that run locally on your computer. Astronomy.net is a web-based program, so if you have internet capability, it's a very accurate and detailed plate solve. So you basically submit your image to the website, it will solve it for you and give you the results. Dithering. Every so many frames, and then for me, somewhere between 2 and 6 usually, the software will send a command to randomly displace the image by a small number of pixels. And 25 is a typical maximum. And that allows us to recognize some hot pixels, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and give us the ability to remove them. It's required for grizzling photographs, which is another technique to improve the detail. And we can greatly improve that with a simple technique, and it works very, very well, and it's very easy to do, and almost all software programs will allow you to do that and specify that. So here's an image frame, fairly highly magnified, and you can see some 3 stars in here. Each one of those little white points is something called a hot pixel. So when we apply power to our sensor, we throw electrons up to the conductive band, and they're zipping across the surface of our semiconductor sensor. Now, if those electrons zoom across a pixel, which happens to be especially hungry, that pixel will grab that electron and it will fill itself up, or what they call talking about filling the well of that particular pixel. And when a pixel is full, it reports that it's a 1, or it reports that it's as bright or it's white as ever going to be. But again, there's no light on the sensor, so that's a false representation or a false reading. So we have to have a mechanism to eliminate that hot pixel when we're trying to make our final photograph. And so I mentioned that the software will send a command to the mount to randomly displace our photograph by a certain amount. And here's what it looks like. So if you take a look at this pixel, you can see our image floating around all over the place. Run that again. So that again gives the software the ability to identify this one physical location on our sensor, which obviously doesn't move. And it now knows that that's a pixel that's basically stuck, or it's a hot pixel, or it's something that's always going to be as bright as possible. And we have the ability to remove that then when we do calibration, which we'll talk about a little later. The meridian flip, the dreaded meridian flip. This is something that scared me, and it will scare most amateur astrophotographers when you get to that point, because you have to physically change the position of your telescope to find the target when you go from the eastern sky to the western sky. So that means you've got to readjust fairly dramatically. And you can image, or you can imagine all the bad things that could happen if that meridian flip isn't properly executed. You know, the camera could hit the tripod, then it breaks off and the camera falls to the ground. Then the tripod leg collapses because the camera hit the tripod leg, and the scope falls to the ground and shatters the mirror. Not a good evening. Something you definitely want to avoid. So you have to be very sure that all the cables will not catch or snag during that flip, and that all equipment will clear the tripod legs. So I spent a significant amount of time basically doing a manual meridian flip with the clutches disabled on my mount, and swinging the scope in all types of configurations as it goes back and forth from east to west to make sure that nothing snagged and nothing hit the tripod and everything was good before I let the computer system take over and do it by itself. So here's a meridian flip of my system one night. I've imaged a target from the eastern sky up to the meridian, and now I have to relocate. So I wait just a short duration so that the target now is in the western part of the sky, and I issue a go-to command from my computer to the mount. So now the mount realizes that the target is in the western sky, so it needs to reorient itself to go find that target. So that's what it's doing right now. It's doing the meridian flip, flipping from the eastern side of the meridian to the western side of the meridian, and now it's going to be looking for that target. So now the system thinks it's found the target. So what happens now, wait about 30 seconds for the mechanical vibrations to subside, then take a photograph of what we think our target is, do a plate solve, and identify our target and find out how far we are away from center, because chances are we're not going to be perfect. So then the computer will issue a command to the mount to move a small distance to recenter that target, take another photograph, plate solve that photograph, determine if it's on center, and if not, do another command set to recenter that target. For me, my experience is typically 2 photographs will exactly center that target. Once a target is centered, the computer will tell the guiding PhD2 to begin again. That'll run for about 30 seconds for that to stabilize. And once the guiding is stabilized and now we're tracking that new target, now the imaging sequence will start. So now that I can follow that target throughout the western sky until I hit sunup or the 35 degrees or my neighbor's trees, and I've been able to image through the entire night and successfully do that meridian flip. Automation. This was a game changer for me. This is huge in trying to automate the image capture. So to automate a system, you need to have some type of a manual process. And for me, that manual process looks something like this. You know, I control my system with the hand controller and my laptop. And at the beginning of the evening, I set 3 alarms on my iPhone. One alarm is when I'm approaching a meridian flip, because I have to mechanically now to make sure that that's going to flip successfully without causing any damage. I set another alarm when my target's going to be reaching 35 degrees. Again, I want to stop imaging because below 35 degrees with that much atmosphere, I don't get very good data. And then about every hour, I set an alarm so that I can check the focus. Again, if you're not in focus, you're recording garbage, and throughout the night, the temperature changes, the scene changes, the position changes, so your focus will change. So it's important to refocus. So that means that I need to be constantly out there with the system. So then after that's taken care of, power on the devices, cool the camera sensor, do a go-to alignment, a polar alignment if required. If I haven't moved the system, I'm still in polar alignment. If I need to recalibrate my guiding software, there's a process to recalibrate the guiding software. And then I can slew to the target, do my focusing, either with eyeballing it or preferably with a batten-off mask or the automatic focuser, do a plate solve and center the target, and then start guiding. And then start the imaging capture by taking a number of images with the exposure time and all the other parameters that are pertinent as far as the capture. Oh yeah, remove the lens cap. I'm sure none of you have ever done that. Believe me, you will. And it's very obvious when you try to start your imaging. So the manual steps. Some of the downside requires constant monitoring. You have to be out there all night long, at least every 30 or every 60 minutes to check on the focus. And certainly when you get close to the meridian, and just in general, you're nervous about what's going on with the system. So that results in a lack of sleep. And in the wintertime, and some of you may laugh at this, but in Arizona, it does get cold. We do have some freezing temperatures. So I found myself outside at night with my parka on, with a down vest underneath, with a fingerless gloves, a stocking cap, and it's cold. So for me, I'm a desert rat. It was cold outside. In summertime, we have boiling desert nights. When the sun goes down, it can still be 105 degrees. So really, it's impossible to cool a camera. The scope's still hot to the touch. The chair on my patio is difficult to set on because it's hot. The sweat's dripping on the keyboard. I got these creepy, crawly little critters zipping across my patio that I'm trying not to step on. And it's just not very fun outside. So you can replace all that with one button. Well, how do you do that? This is what my system looks like now. My laptop's sitting inside. It's connected to my Wi-Fi. Out at my telescope, I have my equipment in a relatively waterproof box. Inside here is now a Windows 11 dedicated computer, which connects to my USB for all my equipment, and it connects to the Wi-Fi in my house. So I use a Windows remote desktop to basically control this computer, which controls my system. This is Nina, my control software, and it looks pretty confusing right now if you're not familiar with it, but it has a lot of pertinent information, which very quickly allows you to take a look at the status of your system and what's going on, as well as the progress over as to where you're at in your imaging plan and what's going on. And it gives you a representation of what's going on with your guiding, as well as what's happening with some of your other system elements, and also a snapshot of what you're looking at. This is just a quick look at what Nina looks like internally and how it controls my system during the evening. And there are other software tools that do that, and they all have similar functions. But before we begin, there's a couple of global triggers which apply to every process that falls below. One is a meridian flip, which tells the system how to execute that meridian flip successfully. And there's another add-in to Nina called pushover. What that allows me to do, I can set some gates, and during the night, as the system completes certain phases of the imaging plan, it will send me a text on my phone. And here it shows me that I've completed a particular exposure loop, completed another exposure loop. That particular evening, I'm tracking 2 targets. So now I switch to another target. I get a text that says I'm completing this target. I got another exposure loop. And at some point, as I get to either the morning, I get a note that says sequences are complete. We're shutting down the computer. And that works great if there aren't any problems. However, if there are some problems, I get another panic email or a text message with that annoying little alarm that says something is going on. I don't know what it is, and I don't know what to do. Help. Well, I can go outside then and take a look at my system to try to understand what's wrong or what's happened. and try to correct that, and then begin my imaging from there. However, sometimes I will set up my system before the sun goes down, make sure everything is configured, have my target loaded, and press go. And if I'm away for a while and I get an error message, what do? Well, that power strip on my system is also connected to my Wi-Fi. So if I'm somewhere where I can't zip out to my back patio and take a quick look, I can basically cut the power to my system to make sure that nothing happens and I'm not trying to hammer the camera into the side of the tripod leg or something bad's going to happen. And then when I return, I can go back out and try to solve the problem. Let me back up just a second. Also, we have in the system a start and an end. And then here, this particular evening, are two targets that I'm going to try to image. So to take a quick look at the start, what that does, as I mentioned, I can go out before it gets dark and set everything up at punch go. But this particular command says that nautical dusk, the whole system will not start operating until I reach nautical dusk. This particular evening, that was at 1911. When that happens, then I go through some commands, cool the camera. This particular command will copy every image as it's created to the cloud. So in the morning when I wake up, I can go to the cloud and take a look at the images that were captured that night. The end, I'll park the scope, shut things off, warm up the camera, shut down the copying, and then close down the system, and the system will then be turned off. I also get a visual representation of my target. This particular evening shows me the target through the evening, and I'm again close to the meridian at midnight. Here I'm at 58 degrees in the north, and I can take a look at when my imaging plan starts and stops. But these commands are the ones that really allow me to automate the system with little concern about what's going to go on through the night. This command tells me that it's going to autofocus after an HFR increase. Well, what does that mean? As I mentioned, that every star has a certain dimension or width, and half-flux radius is a measurement of that. If that half-flux radius increases substantially, something has happened. I've lost focus, my seeing is bad, something is going on. So this command tells me that, okay, if that occurs, I'll monitor those for a period of time. If that occurs, I'm going to run the autofocus again so I can make sure that I'm in the best possible focus. Center after drift is a command, and let's say that at midnight, while I'm happily in bed snoozing, clouds start to roll in. So I take an image and there's no stars. The guiding camera cannot find any stars. It can't find a guide star, so they're confused. They're both getting errors. They're basically trying to record images of clouds. The system will continue to take images, and it will continue to take images of those clouds. But let's say at 3 o'clock in the morning, the sky clears. The camera takes another image. Now we have stars. We do a plate solve, and now it determines that I'm not quite centered. So now the system will send commands to my mount to recenter my target. And when I'm recentered on the target, there's a command here that says restore guiding, and then I'll jump back into my imaging plan. So for that period of time when I had clouds, I was still taking images, which I'll throw away later. But as soon as the clouds cleared, I'm back in business again. I'm taking good data. And the rest of this is basically the meat of the imaging plan, which talks about which filter, what the exposure time is, how many I'm taking, how many I loop, and how do I complete that imaging session. So that really allows me to confidently punch that button in the evening before the sun goes down. And with a pretty good degree of confidence, I know that I'm going to be imaging through the night and I'm going to be getting good data. And if something goes wrong, I'm going to get an error message where I can go out and try to correct that and then maybe get back and continue my data collection. Now, all the things I talked about doing essentially manual and with Nina for the large scope can be done now with something called ASI Air. And it's a great little product. It's something less than $300. And for smaller systems, it will do all these things for you. It'll set up the guiding, control your camera, address your autofocusing, you can set up your exposures, your filters. It also has an internal database itself, which you can do some target acquisitions. It'll plate solve, you can set up dithering, it'll control the meridian flip for you, basically automate your process. So for someone getting started in astrophotography, this is a great tool. It's very useful, at least right now, up to at least 1,000 millimeter systems, and now it's getting better and better. So we'll be able to control those systems as well. So highly recommended, does a great job. Any questions on that part of it? We still good? Continue?
Yes.
Back to the 3 C's. We've talked about now setting up how to capture some data. Later on, we'll talk about how to turn that data into actually some images, which we're trying to get to. But then in between, there's the calibration. The light frames and bias frames and dark frames and flat frames and dark flat frames and flat dark frames, and what are they and how do you take them and what do you do with them and why do you take them? Extremely confusing and very difficult for me to kind of get a handle of all that and determine what those are and how to use them and why I'm using them. So let's continue on. So for the next few slides, I'm going to try to demystify image calibration. So let's take a look at that. When you take a photograph or an image, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly. Well, what's the good? Well, those are the photons from your target. That's going to be your picture. That's the whole purpose of trying to do astrophotography, is to capture those photons and generate a photograph. You also get some bad stuff. Every time you apply power to a semiconductor sensor, your CMOS sensor in your camera, whether it's your DSLR or a dedicated astro camera, you're getting some bad items. And it's something called bias, and that's basically the fixed pattern noise. So that's the mechanical layout essentially of that sensor, and it's always there. So we have to find some way to get rid of that. And dark current, often referred to as thermal noise, as the sensor heats up, it creates more and more free electrons. And those free electrons then will scamper across your surface, your sensor, and they'll find those pixels that are especially hungry, and they'll drop into those pixels and create hot pixels. So that in order to be able to cool your camera, you can reduce that. But in any case, whether you're cooling or not cooling, you have to be able to identify those issues and be able to get rid of those hot pixels. Now, this thermal noise is time and temperature dependent. So the longer your imaging exposure, the worse that's going to be, and the higher the temperature, the worse that's going to be. And the ugly stuff, those are the optical aberrations of your imaging train. That's the dust that gets on your filter. That's the dust that gets on the surface of your camera. That's the vignetting that you're going to see some darkening in the corners. Those are some optical reflections, perhaps in your imaging train, or maybe even your dew shield, all sorts of things that are going to appear in your photograph. And those are probably the most difficult things to get rid of. So a single exposure. Here's the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good stuff are the photons from our signal, or our target, and it's in there someplace. The ugly stuff is the optical aberrations. We just took a photograph. And the bad stuff is that bias and that dark current that's a property of our semiconductor sensor. Oh, by the way, I'd like to thank Adam Block of Adam Block Studios. These are charts that I've taken out of his presentations. I'm a student of his on his website, and he was kind enough to give me permission to use some of his charts. So calibration, what do we do? Well, here's our light frame, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So what we do is we take a picture of the bad and we eliminate it. We take a picture of the ugly and eliminate it. And what we're left with is a single exposure with only the photons from our target. That's what we've been trying to get to, and it seems like a pretty simple process, right? Well, let's take a look at that in some detail. Bad frames. How do we get rid of the bad frames? Well, dark frames, what we're doing is we're taking a picture of our sensor with no light at all that's striking our sensor. So we're basically taking the bad image of what our sensor is producing all by itself. So for my particular system, I have a dew shield. It's got a cap on it. I have a black filter that I put in my filter wheel so that I try to prevent any light at all from reaching the camera. I also found that I had a leak. So a little black electrical tape around that interface solved that problem. And I'll take my dark images at night, some cloudy night when I can't image, and I'll just set up my system to take exposures all night long. And usually I'll take exposures, well, of course, I'll take exposures at whatever kind of the current imaging temperature I'm using. I'll usually take about 25 frames, and I'll take those at typical exposures, which often used at 60, 120, 300, and 600 seconds. And I'll just turn the system loose and let it run all night long and build a black library. The bias that is present whether or not the exposure is a 5,000th of a second or 10 seconds. So you can take the bias exposures at a very fast exposure rate and take a lot of them and take those very, very quickly. Now, those dark frames or those calibration frames are good probably for 6 to maybe even 12 months because the sensor doesn't really change very much as it ages. So I'll take a library and I'll use that for at least 6 months, and I'll use that perhaps probably longer if I don't get around to redoing some calibration frames. Flat frames. These are tough ones. It can be very difficult to get good flat frames that calibrate out those problems, out those pieces of dust and those aberrations. The way I set up, and it's very common with most people when you see some of the process and the threads, is that this is my system. It's pointing directly up. I have the dew shield, and on top of the dew shield, I have some T-shirts. In this particular case, I have 4 layers of T-shirts in a needle pointing hoop. And the reason that is help diffuse some of the light because the light panel is typically fairly too bright. And also it helps diffuse the light very evenly across this whole area. So I get a nice even light on the sensor that I'm trying to take. The light panel I use is one I just got off Amazon. It's a relatively inexpensive one. It's a 5-volt light panel. So it plugs in directly to my USB hub, my powered USB hub, and gets power from my USB hub. So I don't need a separate power supply. It has a low, medium, and high setting, which sometimes is still too bright. So in order to diffuse that even more, I use a neutral density optical filter. Well, you can go to an optical supply house and buy a neutral density filter, and they can be very, very expensive. But you don't really need that precision. So what I do is I go to my local auto parts store, and I bought several densities of window tinting film and just experimented with the combinations of the intensity in the film and the filter to get the exposure that I needed for the flat frames. So it took me probably 2 or 3 evenings of experimentation to develop my my flat process, which looks something like this coming up. It's recommended that you take flat frames from 1 to 5 seconds with about 30,000 ADU. Well, what does that mean? The 1 to 5 seconds is a long enough time frame to get a good exposure of those optical aberrations. And plus, it's important if you're using a flat panel that maybe has an AC power supply and has a refresh going on, that below 1 second, what you might be photographing are the vertical or horizontal bars of the refresh rate. So that 1 second or greater gets you above that threshold and gives you a nice, stable, flat frame. And there's no real reason to exceed 5 seconds because you'd like to take them as quickly as possible without wasting too much time. Now, why 30,000 ADU? 30,000 ADU puts us approximately in the center of our bandwidth of light sensitivity. Down here at 0, we're black, and at 65,535, we're as white as it's gonna possibly get. So 30,000 is kind of halfway between the 0 and 65,000. And you can see on this particular curve of the sensor that I plotted, I've got a nice linear curve here from 1 second to maybe up to 5 seconds. So anywhere along that curve, I've got a linear distribution. I'm fairly bright, so I can get a good response on the aberrations, and I know that I'm producing a pretty good flat frame. And again, that was arrived at just by experimenting with the intensity of my light panel and the various neutral density filters and exposures over a period of 2 or 3 evenings. What that resulted in was that when I take my flat frames, I take flat frames for all my filters. I have luminosity red, green, and blue for my monochrome camera, and also the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen, which are the filters for the Hubble palette. So for that configuration, I have the T-shirt on all of those. And for the RGB filters, I have the neutral density filter in place. My light panel's at medium, and I'm getting exposures between 1 and almost 3 seconds at around 30,000 ADU, just exactly where I want to be. For sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen, since they're only, in this case, 7 nanometer filters, it requires more light to get a good exposure. In this case, I remove the neutral density filter. I kick up the panel to high, and now I'm getting exposures of between 1 and 5 seconds, which, if you remember on that curve, is my linear portion, and around 30,000 ADU, which is perfect. That gives me good quality flat frames, a minimum amount of time of exposure. And if I take a look at a flat frame, this is what one looks like. I hope you can see these little circles or dust motes on the frame. Can you see those? Those are specks of dust on my filter or on my camera. And you'll notice some darkening around the edges. There's some vignetting here as a property of my optical train. And you can almost see kind of a dark band across the top that's darker than the rest. That was actually the problem where, if you remember my off-axis guider where that light prism drops down into the image train, it was a little too far and it caused some shadowing. But the light frame in this case helped remove that. And after that, I was able to pull that prism up just a little farther. This is the 4.3 meter Lowell Discovery Telescope in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's actually about an hour out of Flagstaff, and it's sitting on a mountain that's about 7,500 feet high in literally Bortle 1 sky. It's just incredibly beautiful. So if you look at this telescope, this is the meter or the mirror area. It's about 4.3 meters. This is a secondary mirror. And even the big guys need to take calibration frames. They take their dark frames about once a month on this system. So they'll essentially do the same process. They'll take dark frames with no light hitting the sensors for the typical exposures that they're going to be using in most of their equipment. And then about once a week, they take a flat frame. They'll point the telescope at this wall over to my right. And on this wall, here's their flat panel. It's about a 20-foot by 20-foot panel. They illuminate it from below, and that allows them to evenly illuminate this panel. So when they point the telescope towards this, that's how they take their flat frames. I thought that was really amazing. I was really felt very privileged to be able to tour that telescope last summer, and it was a real experience.
May I ask a question about
Yes.
flat?
Yes, go ahead.
The 30,000 ADU, is that strictly with a 16-bit camera?
In configuration, yes. But for your camera, you're basically want to try to find a somewhere between the midpoint between dark and white, somewhere where you can get a reasonably bright illumination so you can take a good picture of those dust motes and other areas. And that's kind of an experimentation type of a thing. So any reasonably bright. You can also take a look at the histogram. And here's an example of a histogram. You can see here there's some peaks, but I've got a good peak that's somewhere in the center of that histogram. So that shows me that I'm probably getting a good flat. So I'm not clipping on the bottom or the top, and I'm getting a good distribution in the center of a good bright signal.
You ever try sky flats?
Yeah, difficult, unpredictable, always changing. Because every exposure you take is going to be different than the previous one because the sky is constantly changing. Now, for the guys that are in remote observatories, where you've got your telescopes up on the hill someplace in Chile or somewhere in Utah, those guys almost always take sky flats because there's no convenient place to get a flat panel. So the sky flat there is very usable, very doable, and will work pretty well. But for the backyard, it's really easy to set up a system like this. And I said in 15 minutes, I could take flats on all 7 filters. And I know that they're really good flats.
Well, Nina has a good program that adjusts for sky flats as the sun goes down.
Yes, that's very true. Nina's a very good program. They have a great flat or calibration program utility. I found it easy just to do the panel and the regular panel flats, and it's doesn't take very much time, and I know that they're reliable. Any other questions? Okay, well, let's try to tie all that together. Here we have a single exposure. And you can say, well, where's my target? Well, the issue is that, you go outside at night and you look up at the sky and you see all these bright, beautiful stars. And if you're fortunate enough to be in low Bortle areas, you can see the Milky Way, and the sky is just alive with light. But it's dark outside. And when you're taking a picture of the night sky, you're taking a picture of something that's mostly dark. So our data is there, but you can see here on the histogram, it's primarily down on the area where we're up a couple hundred to a couple thousand ADU. And it's difficult to really determine what that is. But our computer gives us the ability to do a stretch. And now we can see what that individual frame looks like. We can see now here's a galaxy core, and here's a galaxy core, and we can see some spiral arms. And that looks a lot like M51. And that's exactly what it is, but that's one single frame. So if we take a look then at the dark frame we just took, that's a highly magnified version of our dark frame. We can see those hot pixels, and you can see the other pixels of irradiations of gray. So we got a calibration here frame for our dark frame. And this is our picture of that flat frame that we took before with those dust motes and some of the vignetting. So again, if we're going to take our calibration, we're going to take the good, the bad, the ugly, take a picture of the bad, which we just saw, and get rid of it. Take a picture of the ugly that we saw and get rid of it, and wind up with our signal. And we'll jump into creation in just a moment. Any questions on calibration? We'll continue from there. Back to the 3 C's of astrophotography. We're now finally getting into creation, where we can, all the work that we've done so far in capturing data and calibrating it and getting ready to make our picture. Let's go make our picture. So in this particular case, M51, there were 133 exposures at 300 seconds with my system at 1960 millimeters shooting at f7. So I had 133 light frames, 25 flat frames, 25 dark frames, and here in this case, 25 bias frames for a total of 208 frames, which generates one master light. So if we take a look at that process, there's our individual frame again. And this is a stretched individual frame. And then this is our final single master light frame we generated from all those things that we put together to calibrate. When you take a look at that and you say, well, you know, that's not very impressive. It certainly is M51. You know, I can see the spirals and I can see the 2 galaxy cores, and you see some of the nebulosities spiraling out of it. But what happened to my colors? And it's really noisy, and I've got some framing issues here on the edges. And what do I do? Well, this is where you go into processing that data, and you can spend sometimes as much time in trying to process the image as you did in collecting it. But to take a quick look at what can happen after you process an image, this is the final image that I processed from this data. So you can see there's a huge difference here between the raw data, the master light, and the final product. And we'll talk about how to get from here to there in just a second. But before that, we get into something called the controversy of science versus art. And again, you'll see lots of discussions and threads and purists talking about art versus reality and scientific data. But science is really the capture of our data, data analysis. This involves telescopes and mounts and alignments and polar alignments and exposures and coordinate and flips and scripts and pixel math and all sorts of things. And then we get to art. And that's really the processing and interpretation of that data. And that's very unique. I'm pretty good at the data part, but I'm not so good at the art part. You know, I've got a decent eye of composition and colors and framing, et cetera, from my experience in shooting lots of DSLR photos. But when it comes to the artistic flair, my drawing skills are pretty much stick figures. But however, the software that's available to you opens up a whole new world of turning that into something beautiful, at least in the individual's eye. And it becomes a very individual journey. Calibration, backroom extraction, noise reduction, sharpening, masking, color, hue, saturation, all those things that are utilized in order to finally perform that and create that final piece of art or your image that you're trying to create. So what that boils down to is that there's no really such thing as a wrong interpretation of the data. That's up to the individual astrophotographer who is working with that data to finally produce that image. So you have a chance to really make it your own. Russell Croman is a name that some of you might recognize. He has been very influential in the last couple of years, producing some really fantastic software processing tools utilizing artificial intelligence. But going back to 2003, he made this quotation. Let me read this. By now, there is one point that should be fairly plain. Virtually all astronomical images that are prepared for general viewing have been significantly modified from their original scientifically useful form. Because of this, and because of the degree of modification is largely determined by the judgment and the taste of the person doing the processing, we must quickly dispense with the hardline notions of what is right and wrong in image processing. for those also become the province of various individual opinions and personal preferences. In other words, preparing an image for general viewing is largely an art. It may be an art that's guided by scientific notions and attention to detail, but it is still an art. This is a screenshot from AstroBin that I did recently of M42. And when I took this screenshot of one page at that point in time, there were 19,184 images posted on AstroBin of M42, all by individual astrophotographers, all working with their own data set, or perhaps a data set they were using. But you can see there's not a one of them that are like different colors, different shapes, different contrasts, different intensities, different orientations, all individual interpretations of the data of that individual. Now, you may look at some of those, critique those, and maybe they don't match up to your idea of what a good astro image is, but the end result is this is the art form that that individual person created. And, it's unique and it's very individual. So again, this is my first astrophoto. So you can see that what I started with, I had a long ways to go. And this is an image of M42 that I made a little over a year later. Substantially different. I'd learned a lot during that time frame. I look back at this now and I can see, well, I could do some better things on the stars, maybe some better colors, and I can do this and I can do that. So the whole thing is that it's a continually evolving and changing process of creating an image from that data. This is a process flow that I basically established for myself. Going back to 2022, I basically jotted some things down in Excel, and I kind of sort of changed that into a chart that I use as a chart when I start processing material, so I can make sure I can go through the steps. And this is sort of a revision of where I'm at today. So briefly, that kind of let me take a look at this for you. Now, I do narrowband processing a lot here in my backyard because I'm sitting in Bortle 8 skies. And narrowband with those narrow bandwidths of filters allows me to capture a lot of data and eliminate a lot of the light pollution issues. I also shoot broadband, RGB and color, both with a monochrome camera using filters and a one-shot color camera. A little more difficult for me because of the light pollution, but it can be done and you can produce some pretty nice images. So in narrowband, there's a couple of different processes I use. Most people are very familiar with the Hubble palette, which is the SHO palette where we map the sulfur, hydrogen, and oxygen to the RGB channels of our process. And then I also do some things with narrowband where I'll take the combinations of, say, hydrogen and sulfur, map it to the red channel, or maybe combinations and map it to the green channel. And there's a little bit different flow when that's involved. In the case of narrowband, I never use the narrowband stars because of the limitation. You're only got a very, very narrow bandwidth and not very good star color. So I always shoot some RGB along with a narrowband just for the process of getting the nice, good colors, clear colors from the stars. In broadband, I'll do the same thing. Obviously, I'm shooting RGB stars as I go. Also on broadband, I will often shoot some hydrogen alpha filters along with the color, because when you're shooting galaxies in particular, there are large areas of hydrogen gas, and there are nice big pink areas that by adding hydrogen alpha to your RGB image, you can bring out those colors. Once I get to the point of working through the initial process and get to the point where I'm going from that linear to the nonlinear phase when I was stretching that image, and then there are various things along the way, and there's a lot of similarities in those processes as far as which ones of those particular items I use in what order. I can go briefly through what's happening here, in that when you combine the photographs, you're taking them over a long period of time, maybe multiple nights, and you'll get a lot of gradations in the background. Graxpert is a program that utilizes artificial intelligence to smooth out that background and equalize it. BlurX is also a program that helps with deconvolution, which brings out some of the detail. Star Exterminator allows you to quickly get rid of those stars, which allows you to work on the detail of the luminosity in the galaxy. And then NoiseX is a noise reduction program, which again uses artificial intelligence to eliminate the noise from your background. Now, all four of those processes actually, when you were done manually, as little as a year ago, were extremely time consuming. But now with the tools that are available to you and artificial intelligence, it greatly simplifies the process and really produces some outstanding results. Same thing for when you get into doing the nonlinear activity. You're basically stretching that image so that you can work on it There's a normalization script that can be utilized in narrowband. Get to the point where you're doing selective color or working with color curves or saturations or color masks. This is also an area where often people go back and forth perhaps between PixInsight, which is the program I use, and Photoshop, and being able to modify their colors and saturation, and then continuing on with the process. So if anyone would like to talk about some of these details of some of those processes later, be happy to do that. I'll leave my contact information. So anytime you'd like to give me a call or send me an email, always happy to talk to another astrophotographer and exchange ideas and comments. So let's take a look at some activity. This was an image that I did back in February of 2022, and this was my first attempt at photographing the hydrogen filter along with the RGB and bringing the hydrogen back in to exemplify or to amplify some of these hydrogen alpha regions. So, sort of okay. Not a lot of great detail. Was kind of the first step. This was an image I did later in the year. I actually took additional data with this image of the same target and took the hydrogen alpha image with the RGB images and then brought it back in. So now you can see those hydrogen alpha areas really pop. And this one in particular is one of the largest hydrogen areas that have been identified in some of the galaxies you look at. So these are all huge star formation areas. But adding this hydrogen alpha filter to the RGB really makes it pop. And again, the artificial intelligence tools, the deconvolation tool, the noise tool, and the star externio tool are tremendous advances in the whole processing technology for not only the amateur astrophotographer, but also the professional. So this was the Eagle Nebula that I shot back in May of 2022, and the good old the Pillars of Creation. Okay, I struggled a long time in trying to get to this point, but obviously there's a lot of detail here that I was missing and really couldn't bring out. Now, this is an image that I did in January of 2023, taking exactly the same data I used originally, adding no new data whatsoever, but utilizing those new processes with the artificial intelligence tools and also something called generalized hyperbolic stretch, as well as an improved color calibration. So you can see the tremendous difference between the first image and the last image by just utilizing the new tools and the new process. Lots of detail now in this nebulosity in this area, which is basically blurred out completely. And after finding this final image, I found that this particular pillar here was just as fascinating to me as the Pillars of Creation. But whereas in the original photograph, it was basically lost completely. There was no detail there. But again, this is just not much more than a year, not even that, in the advancement of processes and tools and how far we've come as far as the hobby and being able to produce images. This is just a compilation of a number of images that I shot with my one-shot color camera and the Canon DSLR in my backyard. Again, these are all from my backyard, all Bortle 8 skies. So it continues to amaze me as to really what the detail you can get out of some pretty light polluted areas. These are some images that I took with my monochrome camera, utilizing filters, both RGB filters as well as the sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen filters. Just some, I really like this one with the Tadpole Nebula, IC410. And the amazing thing about some of these is these strains are about 10 light years long. So the distance and the immensity of some of these targets is just incredible. Some other favorite photographs of mine, the Spider Nebula, Thor's helmet, really a fascinating target. Lots of detail and nebulosity with colors and all the nebulosity involved. Just a beautiful target. This is one I spent a long time on in processing, trying to tease out the tentacles of the Shrimp Nebula, and was able to kind of pull those out and very satisfied with that. And this is one that's not necessarily so much for the detail, but from the immensity of the target. This first galaxy is 41 million light years away. The second galaxy here is 290 million light years away, and this one is 370 million light years away. It's still really difficult to kind of get your mind around the tremendous size and distance and intensity of the items we're looking at as far as space. This was the core of 7822. I was processing it one day, and it almost looked like there was an image in the center of the core. So I went in and darkened the eyes and added some flames from the eyebrows and added some contrast to the teeth and made this kind of ghostly image. So this is definitely the artist's interpretation of real data. It has nothing to do with the reality of scientific data of this one, but it was just fun to do. This particular galaxy, again, shooting in RGB and border light skies, I was really happy with the way it turned out because the hidden galaxy really lies close to the galactic plane of our Milky Way galaxy. So there tends to be a fair amount of nebulosity and dust between us and this target, but it really came out quite well. I took quite a few hours of imaging on this and very pleased with the way it came out, just to really show you that even in border light skies with RGB, you can take some fairly good photographs. Again, this is the Whirlpool, the first one I did, and then the second one I did later. This particular target was a small planetary nebula. It took me about 30 or 35 hours of exposure to get this, but just had some really beautiful colors and the intensity of the core of the expanding nebula. Just in general, some images I took last year with the monochrome camera. The Veil Nebula is really a fascinating target. There's really some interesting things that you can zero in. This was at 300 millimeters, a wide angle shot. The Rosette Nebula is a favorite of a lot of people. The Propeller Nebula I thought was really fascinating with some of the nebulosity floating out here to the side. And the Herbig-Haro items with the jets emanating from the top of the star formation area, really pretty fascinating. Just some more images, but this one in particular was my first attempt at a mosaic. This is with the 300 millimeter telescope. This is 6 panels, Bernard's loop, which is still not enough to really encompass the entire loop. So this is one that I'm going to return to and take some more panels. I started with 6 just as the first experiment to make sure that I could do it and stitch it together and get down the process. And now I feel confident enough that I can go back and take some more panels and try to fill this in and do a more complete image. California Nebula is always a pretty one in SHO, and this is the normalized version of it. This is the Heart and Soul Nebula. It's a couple of beautiful nebulas. This is at 300 millimeters, and in this small section of the nebula, I zeroed in at 2,000 millimeters, and you can see what looks to be sort of also like a bird with this creature sneaking up from behind. So really, again, some fascinating things that you can find when you start to zero in high magnification of some of these items. And this is again, a 200 millimeter or 2,000 millimeter shot of a portion of the Veil Nebula called the Bat. And you can see the feet up above, and it's hanging upside down with the mouth and the nose below. So you can identify lots of caricatures in some of the nebulas themselves that mean something to you. This is the one that I was really pleased with. Wide angle shot of M31. This is about 62 hours of exposure with RGB, and then processed in PixInsight primarily. And last year, we had the rare treat of amateur and professional astronomers as well as seeing a very significant supernova in 101. This was SN 2023 IXF, and you can see that this galaxy is almost 170 light years across, but the size that the supernova showed up is just immense. So you can imagine what this thing might be like close up. And this was 21 million years ago, so it'd be interesting to really understand what that supernova looks like today. This is AstroBin for me. Again, I publish all my images on AstroBin under AstroSys, so if you're interested, all those are there, and you can look at the technical card on any one, just like any photographer, and take a look at the equipment I use and the filters I use and the exposures and some description of what that target is and what's available. Again, a tremendous resource for anybody thinking about astrophotography, or just in general to take a look at a lot of really, really pretty photographs. Any questions on that portion?
For the Hubble telescope, is that strictly scientific data, or is there some artistic work on it?
On the ones they actually produce from Hubble?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that there's some creativity involved there as well, because they're really mapping some of the captured data into colors that we can see in the visible eye. Certainly the Webb telescope is an infrared, so everything we see from Webb is redirected to a bandwidth which the human eye can visualize. So that is definitely a pretty creative process. Now they take longer wavelengths and try to map them to the longer wavelengths of RGB or our visible spectrum, as well as shorter wavelengths. So relatively long wavelengths and short wavelengths are mapped to the long wavelengths and short wavelengths of our eye. but the colors are representations of translation from infrared. Hubble's probably more accurate because it's more of a visible imaging system. Any other questions? Okay. Recommendations. If I had it to do all over again, what would I do? Well, don't do what I did. I started out with a 2000 millimeter scope. I made it extremely hard on myself. I learned a tremendous amount, but the small field of view, the guiding issues, plate solving, focusing, meridian flips, everything else makes it a difficult process. I did learn quickly, but it was painful. But it did really establish a good baseline for really understanding that whole process and extending that to other systems. So really, I would say most everybody has a DSLR and a tripod. You know, take that out to the backyard and take so much photographs and start to migrate to maybe a wide angle telescope, something in the 300 to 500 millimeter range. And ASR is a tremendous tool right now in that area. You control most all of the activity of this smaller wide angle scope, and it gets some tremendous views like some of the ones I saw of the Heart and Soul Nebula and that the Mosaic and the Veil Nebula. Those are all the things that fit into the range of something less than 500 millimeters, and you can get the entire frame in. And add equipment to complement it. And don't worry about buying everything to begin with. Find out what you're interested in. And one thing I haven't done yet for myself is planetary. I would like to, but that's a different process, some different software, and a whole different educational process. So hopefully this coming year, I want to do some experimentation with planetary. So again, capture that with your DSLR. Take some timed exposures. Make sure you get a remote shutter release, because if you try to press even for a 10-second time exposure, something, the camera will still vibrate and cause you some issues. So consider a star tracker or a similar tracking device that allows your camera to be able to track the target across the sky. So with that DSLR, you can take some long exposures and get some really, really nice photographs. I really hadn't talked about this, but Deep Sky Stacker is a free program that will allow you to take those individual frames, combine those with those calibration frames you're taking, and generate those mastered light frames. And you can photograph or process in Photoshop. That's where a lot of people start. I started processing in Photoshop. Right now, I primarily use PixInsight, but now a lot of people use a combination of PixInsight and Photoshop, or there's a variety of other programs as well, and combining that with Photoshop, using Photoshop to kind of finish off the process. Then add a telescope when you're ready with a focal length of something less than 500 millimeters, probably a refractor, a Dobby or a Nude or something, Skywatcher, Explore Scientific, ASCAR, Williams Optics, Orion. There's a whole number of manufacturers that make some really, really good telescopes that are very reasonably priced and are high quality equipment. And spend as much money as you can on your mount, your tripod. You'll find that's an investment that you'll never regret. Even though it might be a capacity way over what your initial scope is, you'll find that it gives you the ability to grow into that, and it handles it extremely well. There's a strain-away scopes now on the market, or just mounts on the marketplace. ZOWO has something called the AM5, which I purchased. I really like it. It's lightweight, it's economical as far as price, and does a really, really good job. So if you're looking at something in the range of less than 500 millimeters or so, the AM5 is a great complement. Plus, it can handle significantly larger scopes as well. It has a great load comparing capacity. And as soon as you can, go ahead and invest in that cooled Astro camera. That makes the whole process much easier. Being able to cool that sensor, it makes the calibration frames easier and makes the more consistent as far as your imaging. And ASI Air, again, for many, many systems, it does a great job. It gives you be able to handle all these aspects of it. You start to learn about what guiding is and how to do their framing and doing plate solving. It helps you do all that with a minimum amount of input. And it's a great learning tool as far as learning all those aspects of the process. This is my system that I'm using, the 300 millimeter in addition to the 2000 millimeter edge scope. But the 300 millimeter scope was less than $1,000. The guide scope was $110, and the camera was $149. You know, the mount was that time was about $2,300. You're going to spend around $1,500 to $2,000 plus for a good quality mount. Camera, if your DSLR is fine, you can go up to $2,000 for a really, really good camera as far as a dedicated astro camera. And the DSLR is less than $300. So there's some expense involved, but this particular system is a really good quality system that you can take some amazing photographs with for a long, long period of time. And you can't learn from a book. By the time something is print, with the technology is changing as quickly as it is, it's obsolete. So YouTube is a great asset. YouTube forums, Facebook groups, find some that you like, join up, read the threads, and you'll find out that you can advance very, very quickly with that. And choose your mentors wisely. Again, like I mentioned earlier, before I even had a scope, I was on some of the threads giving some advice. So be careful who you line up with. These are some people that I use and I've worked with as far as using their YouTube channels. Found them to be very reliable, very detailed, and providing really good information, helping me a lot to be able to learn a lot about astrophotography and my equipment. So any of these guys, you can't go wrong, but there's a multitude of others. So again, do some experimentation, find some people that you trust and utilize them and sign on their channels. Also, as you're doing your YouTube research, you'll find out you get a lot of different categories. So I really highly recommend that within your YouTube system, develop a bunch of folders for the different types of items you're looking at, whether it's imaging or capture or calibration or particular equipment styles or whatever. This will allow you to go back to those folders and very quickly take a look at some of those YouTube and get back to them quickly. Also, be prepared to spend maybe 20% of the cost of your equipment on software and training. Really don't skimp when it comes to training. It'll save you a lot of time and frustration and really accelerate your quest for the perfect image. Image processing, it can be a stiff learning curve. It takes a lot of time really to understand and feel like you're getting somewhat competent at that. But again, follow the YouTube videos. Will be extremely helpful. Photoshop helps a lot as far as doing initial processing. If you're really going to get into image processing and control and calibration, PixInsight is a great tool. It's not an inexpensive tool. It's a few $100s, but it's well worth the value. And again, use training. Block is a good one that I've used. Masters of PixInsight is another one. Visible Arc is a guy up in Canada who's got some great information. And there's a number out there. But again, find a YouTube channel perhaps that you like and a training that's being offered and zero in on that. And you'll find that that's something that you can really work with, and it'll be very, very beneficial. So, start now, take lots of pictures, stack with maybe Deep Sky Stacker, which is free, process with Photoshop, get started, and enjoy your successes. And it's great pictures, great fun. It's easy as can be, really. And your family's going to be amazed because they love you. And your friends really won't understand. They'll just say, well, that's nice. But really, it's hard. Astrophotography is hard, and it does take some effort, but don't be discouraged. But along the way, take some time and make sure you enjoy your triumphs. So what happened in 2023 for me? I spent lots of time on YouTube. Again, I picked out the mentors that meant something to me. I learned a lot about using PixInsight and some of the processes and some of the new tools. Probably one of the biggest things was being able to automate my system, so that I had confidence in turning my system loose and capturing lots of data. One thing I found, especially in my skies of Bortle 8, it takes me a lot of exposure time to get good data. So typically on a target, I'm at least at 10 hours, oftentimes 20. And on the one of M31 I mentioned before, that was 60 hours. And at dark sky site, if you have the ability to go to there, you'll significantly reduce the amount of exposure time required. But this just shows you that in relatively light polluted backyards, you can still do some pretty nice astrophotos. Guiding, I learned a lot about guiding. I actually did a little hyper tuning on my mount to improve the guiding. Automated my flat system, so I'm comfortable with that, can do it in a short period of time. I used to spend a lot of time trying to reject the bad frames before I really went into processing. But now I really realize and utilize the software to really get rid of all of those bad frames and rely upon that to do that for me. Shoot lots of narrowband, which really applies to my light polluted areas. And really, simplify. You can really get hung up in looking at all the YouTube videos and all the details of things that you want to work with and try to incorporate all those great new techniques into your process. And it's just going to be extremely confusing. So you saw from earlier my basically flow chart. I tried to simplify a lot of those processes and eliminate some of the time consuming things that really don't have much return. What's next? For me, spending more time on targets, getting better data. I'm going to go reshoot some of the targets and compare my progress. Experiment more with narrowband, which really applies to my backyard. Plan out my targets for the next 3 months. You saw my calendar where I've got lots of choices, so I need to take a look at some things I'd really like to image. And mosaics. That one mosaic that I did with 6 panels, I want to go back and expand that and get better at doing mosaics or larger mosaic targets. Combining the Hubble palette and the RGB palette, various combinations. And then working with luminosity. Didn't talk a lot about that, but that's something where I've got a lot to learn and being able to incorporate that and bringing out the detail in both narrowband and broadband images. And I'm a little bit involved with the Amateurs Astronomers Association. Several of the members in our local club are actually working at ASU's department and are doing contributions themselves. This is a great way for amateur astronomers to contribute to science. And that one program they had was studying flares on a distant star and trying to determine the effect on solar flares on planets in the Goldilocks band of that particular star. Well, that's something that with a large telescope or a satellite, you really can't zero in on that star and wait for a flare to occur for the next several weeks. But for amateur astronomers, you can spend a few hours a night here in my territory, and astronomers all around the world can follow that target 24/7. And if a flare occurs in a period of time, someone somewhere in the world will capture that flare. And then that information can be submitted to that particular program or that experimentation is going on. And if that paper is published, you often can get your name in the finished paper as being a contributor to that. So as an individual astronomer, an amateur astronomer, you can make a significant contribution to science by joining in on some of the programs. So that's sort of the end, but really it's just kind of the beginning, because when you're dealing with a hobby that deals with infinity, really it's to infinity to beyond. So again, it's been my pleasure to talk about my journey into astrophotography, and I hope it's been useful. And every day is a new challenge, and I feel like I'm drinking from a fire hose again and learning every day that I try to do an image. So if you'd like to talk about anything we talked about today or exchange some information, there's my email address. Feel free to give me a buzz. Be happy to work with you and talk about astrophotography. So again, thanks.
Well, I would say, wow. So many of the things that we talk as a group, particularly the new folks, are you answered them all. So I hope people review this video when it comes out, because I mean every question that I get posed, I think you answered them. I mean personally may have a little different approaches, but I'm looking at the people that's on the channel right now. A lot of them are asking questions that I think you answered. So watch the video again or many times, because he's covered all the steps. Any questions, anybody?
Yeah. Thank you, Sid.
Yes, thank you.
Say what, Les?
I said thank you, Sid. You did cover a lot of them.
Yeah, my pleasure again. Thanks a lot. And it's always fun to talk about astrophotography. Again, anyone who's interested, give me a buzz or take a look at AstroBin, and always happy to talk.
Anybody else? I think we've lost some of the people during the presentation, but it's cool. But it'll get on video as soon as Jeremy renders it and posts it. But this is very, very helpful for everybody, newbies in particular. But you're way beyond a new person. You learned the journey quite well.
Well, it's a challenge, and it's always lots of fun. So I spend a lot of time enjoying it. Always something new.
Always something new. Yeah. Anybody else?
I do have a question, but I'm not sure if anyone has an answer to it. So using a Vatanov mask or an electronic focuser, you're trying to, get the stars as small as possible. And I've seen, especially dealing with planetary, that the recommendation is to focus on the object you're targeting. And I'm wondering why that focus would be different from the focus you get from making stars small.
Well, the autofocus routine actually takes into consideration a wide variety of stars in the frame. So in your target, it's not exactly just one star. It's looking at multiple stars and then trying to determine the smallest possible diameter of the half-flux radius. So it sort of does an integration of the entire frame to get the best possible focus. Does that make sense?
So why would the focus point on the surface of a planet, for example, be different from that?
Don't know. As I say, that planetary is something that I'm not really involved in. I'd like to get engaged in, but I really haven't done any planetary. But I would think it should be similar because it's going to integrate various points across the image and try to obtain the smallest focus. That's a good question as far as planetary.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Well, we've had some comments that are very appreciative of your presentation and taking the time to do so. So, Sid, thank you so much. Very, very helpful. A lot of technical and practical information. I think we'll sign off then. Rick.
Okay. Thanks again.
Right. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone. Join us again next month.